Good. Okay, so I'm going to read you the San Remo Agreement as far as our topic for this evening is concerned. And it's literally one page. The high contracting parties agree to entrust, by application of the provisions of Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, the administration of Palestine within such boundaries as may be determined by the principal allied powers, to a mandatory to be selected by the said powers. The mandatory will be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917 by the British government and adopted by the other allied powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The terms of the mandates in respect of the above territories will be formulated by the principal allied powers and submitted to the Council of the League of Nations for approval. So there it is, folks. And I suppose I could end the lecture right there, but I think I better unpack what all of that means. All right. This agreement, which is exactly 100 years old this week, has direct implications for all of the current discussions that are going on about Jewish peoplehood, about Judaism as a religious community or a national group, about the sovereign rights, who has them in Israel and Palestine, the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, the issue of occupation, the issue of territories, the necessity or not of a two-state solution, and more. That one page is a pivotal document for all of those different issues. So let me begin with the historical context. All right, 100 years ago, obviously, 1920, was right after World War I. In World War I, or as a result of World War I, 4 empires collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and for us, the most important, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. Pardon me. All right. As a result of the collapse of those empires, a whole slew of new nations came into existence. All right. Egypt, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Pakistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Israel, Syria, Finland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Iceland, Ireland, Albania, Luxembourg, Hungary, Austria, Yugoslavia, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Czechoslovakia, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. At least 28 countries were formed because of this. And I may be missing some. Now, in many, if not most, of those countries, there is a crazy quilt of ethnicities, right? None of them are purely Finnish or purely Ukrainian or purely Austrian. And the minorities in a country, a newly formed country, say Austria, right? The minority is of necessity subsumed under some other national heading. Think, for example, Yugoslavia, that included Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Slavonia, Dalmatia, Slovenia, and Serbia. Didn't work out all that well. Iraq, same thing. Kurds, Sunni Arabs, Shia Iranians. Didn't work out all that well there either. And then you have Palestine, that included Jews and, well, we'll see who else it included. So you need to see what happened in Israel in this context, in the context of the formation of all of these new nations based on the principle of self-determination, each of them containing one or more minority groups that did not match the ethnic character of the majority. Now, in previous laws of war before the 20th century, you kept what you conquered. So in other words, it would have been perfectly typical, I don't want to say the word appropriate, but legal, assumed, common, it would have been all of that it would have been, all of that if Britain and France, who had defeated the Ottoman Empire during World War I, if they simply took over the Ottoman Middle East and kept it for their own. That would have been standard operating procedure. That's not what happened here. It is, in fact, a misreading of French and British policy to see them as colonial powers. Sure, they wanted to maintain their influence over those territories. Among other things, the British were concerned about controlling the Suez Canal. Yeah, they wanted to have influence, right? But they did not incorporate these territories into their empires. Instead, based on the principle of self-determination, they ceded control of these territories to the locals in the territory, locals who were brought up to readiness to form their own governments and then their own states. And the mandatory system, you might have heard the expression, the British Mandate for Palestine. The mandatory system was set up to avoid what we today would call failed states. So here's the language. The intent was to support, quote, colonies and territories inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world as a sacred trust of civilization. And this is very Wilsonian language, Woodrow Wilson's language, that the idea here is that you have these sophisticated, modern industrial nations, Europe, the United States, and then you had these other nations that really could not match up to them in terms of, certainly in terms of military power. And the idea was to help these nations come into their own. So there would be a mandatory system set up, that is to say, have somebody in charge of the mandate until they reach, quote, reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory power until such time as they were able to stand alone. Now, that wasn't just what was supposed to happen in Palestine. That was what was supposed to happen all over the place. All right. The locals in the Ottoman Empire were, among others, Arabs and Jews. And they, back then, 100 years ago, made common cause before the world powers. It may sound a little bit odd today, but we do have the letter between Emir Faisal ibn Hussein from Saudi Arabia, the leader of the Arab revolt against the Turks, think Lawrence of Arabia, and Chaim Weizmann, head of the Zionist movement, supporting, and I'm quoting, all necessary measures to encourage and stimulate immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale. We regard the Zionist positions, said Faisal, as moderate and proper. We will do our best insofar as we are concerned to help them through. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. And they were talking, in the exchange of letters, they were talking about, at that point, 2.5 million Jews coming into what today is Israel. Now, I don't want to exaggerate how wonderful this all sounds, because at exactly the same time that Faisal was saying this, he was saying the opposite to the various Arab leaders, where he was jockeying for position to take control of what he had hoped to be one large Arab state, sort of renewing the caliphate under his control. He was perfectly prepared to change his position in order to enhance his power. All right. But nevertheless, his agreement with Weizmann is an indication, A, that the Arabs knew what Zionism would mean, and B, that the world knew that the Arabs knew what Zionism would mean. and see that the Jews knew, that the world knew, that the Arabs knew what Zionism would mean. And the reason I emphasize all of this is because you will read in the propaganda journals all kinds of nonsense about how, oh, this all happened behind closed doors and nobody knew what was happening and they didn't understand. They were lied to, they were tricked. That's a bunch of nonsense. Everybody knew exactly what was going on and why. Right? Now, not only that, but there were voices in opposition to this scheme. So you had, in particular, an American voice. You had a commission called the King-Crane American Commission, and they sent over people to check out the situation. They described their qualification for doing this precisely that because they didn't know anything about the Middle East, and so therefore they could be objective, which I think is a really interesting approach, not all that distant from what we're doing now. And so they went over and they were prepared to deny the political aspirations of the Zionist movement and instead define the Jews merely as a religious community, one of many, that would be under the control of Faisal and the majority Arab population. They said, and I'm quoting, Jewish immigration should be definitely limited, and the project of making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up. And this reflected Faisal's position, not to Weizmann, but to the Arabs, where he said, quote, we oppose the pretensions of the Zionists to create a Jewish commonwealth in the southern part of Syria, known as Palestine, and oppose Zionist migration to any part of our country, for we do not acknowledge their title. Now, the significance of those two statements cannot be overstated, because what it means was a proposition was being made to force the Jews to be considered merely a religious community, not a national entity, but a religious community. That proposal was shot down. All right. Faisal was making the statement that, on behalf of the Arabs, that they do not recognize the title of the Jews, the property title to the Jews, to the land, what became the land of Israel. All right. All right. That proposition was shot down. So these were topics that were publicly debated and publicly rejected by the powers that be. San Remo is a direct rejection of those views. All right. And it is important to underscore that both the King-Crane Commission and Faisal knew full well that what the Balfour Declaration was about was, quote, the project of making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth, unquote. Why do I emphasize that? Because there are those who look at the language of the Balfour Declaration that was incorporated into the San Remo Agreement and point out that it says that it's supposed to make a national home for Jews in Palestine. And they try to read that as if it is saying not that the Jews will control Palestine, but that within Palestine there will be this cultural center, this home for Jews. Both King Crane and Faisal, and of course everybody else, knew that that's not what those words meant. They all understood that a national home for the Jewish people was synonymous with the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth. All right. Now, the San Remo Agreement, or the conference, which took place from April 19th to April 26th in 1920, appointed Britain as the mandatory power precisely in order to put into effect the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917. All right. The declaration, and I'm quoting, in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, let me unpack a bunch of that. All right. one thing that's really crucial to understand is that the British were to go on over the next several decades and betray their mandate. Remember, their mandate was to help establish this Jewish national home. That's why they got the mandate. They were given the mandate specifically for that purpose. What they did was to betray that purpose. They chose instead, at a certain point, to block Jewish immigration and to work against the establishment of an independent Jewish state. So in other words, when they were doing that in the 1930s and 1940s, all right, what they were doing was a direct violation of the very principles that allowed them to get the mandate in the first place. That's number one. Number two, we have to look carefully at that language about nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. All right. Everybody knew that there were existing non-Jewish communities, all right, particularly Arab Christians, but also Muslims, all right, and everybody knew that they would continue to be there when this Jewish national home began, all right. What was supposed to happen was that their religious rights were going to be respected. Nobody was going to get in the way of, Christians living as Christians, going to church and so forth. Nobody was getting in the way of Muslims, being able to pray the way Muslims pray, or, follow their religion, go to mosques, have their own schools and so forth. A, and B, their civil rights in terms of, for example, property rights, that nobody could just go in and confiscate their property without payment, because they, like everybody else, had civil rights there. But what is missing from that phrase are national or political rights. All right. And the French tried to get that language into the document, and it was rejected. They were rejecting the idea that the local Arabs in Palestine had the political right, for example, to claim national self-determination. That was not guaranteed. Their religious rights were guaranteed, their civil rights were guaranteed, their national and political rights were absolutely not guaranteed. All right. So the idea that somehow Palestine, that built into the mandate, was the sort of the built-in two-state solution, that it was mandated both that there be a state for the Jews and a state for the non-Jews, is absolutely false. Now, it's a possible outcome, I grant you that, but it is absolutely not a necessary or legally demanded outcome. The last part I'll mention is that nothing should prejudice the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And what this is referring to is that, remember, a very large part of the Jewish community at that time, 100 years ago, was not Zionist. They were pushing very hard the idea that they're not interested in some national escapade on the other side of the world, but were perfectly content being, for example, French citizens or British citizens. And so that was put in there in order to protect them, us, people living in the diaspora, so that the nations of the world will not be able to look at us and say, well, now you have an Israel, you have to go there, you can't stay here. You're not really an American or British citizen anymore, now you have to go there. Built into this was an agreement that that would not happen. Okay, the mandate was ratified on July 24th, 1922 by a, wait for it, unanimous vote of the Council of the League of Nations. Let me repeat that, a unanimous vote by the Council of the League of Nations. Now, could you imagine a unanimous vote in the United Nations today in support of the establishment of Israel? Back then, it was agreed unanimously. Now, I've seen different numbers about whether it was 51, 52, or 54 nations in the League of Nations at that time. I don't know exactly which one, but it was unanimous. And the United States, which was not a member of the League of Nations, typical, we helped set it up, but then we but then we did not join it. It separately ratified or agreed to the principles decided by the Council of the League of Nations. So everybody on the planet, every political actor on the planet was in agreement about what was going to happen, that a Jewish commonwealth was going to be set up in Palestine. Now, as I said, the purpose of the mandate was to help states that had been subject to the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman occupation for 400 years to become independent. Remember, the Ottomans took over in approximately 1517. That's when they conquered Jerusalem. And they were there, almost literally 400 years in charge of what today is Israel. All right. Now, it was recognized, I'll talk about this more in a minute, that the exception here was Palestine, because Palestine was not only occupied by the Ottomans, but had previously been occupied by the Romans. That's why we were kicked out. Okay. So the political rights in Syria and Mesopotamia, otherwise known as Iraq, were held in trust for the Arab people who were in majority, and that those political rights were to vest and become actual when the Arabs could exercise sovereignty. And that position ultimately led to the creation of 4 states: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, formerly called Transjordan. Similarly, the political rights to Palestine were held in trust for Jews, specifically in light of our historical association with the land. Ephraim Karsh, who's a great scholar about these things, he wrote that the mandate, quote, signified an unqualified recognition by the official representative of the will of the international community of the Jews as a national group, rather than a purely religious community, and acknowledgement of the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine as, quote, the grounds for reconstituting their national home in the country, unquote. And this is reflected in the writing of Jules Chambon, who was the Secretary General of the French Foreign Ministry, writing on June 4th of 1917. And I'm quoting, "You consider that circumstances permitting and the independence of the holy places being safeguarded, on the other hand, it would be a deed of justice and of reparation to assist, by the protection of the Allied powers, in the renaissance of the Jewish nationality in that land from which the people of Israel were exiled so many centuries ago." All right, that's in a letter to the Zionist leader Nachum Sokolow. All right, now understand the significance of this, because to this day, you will hear people say that Zionism was a response to the Holocaust, and that the reason we are in Israel is that the Europeans who murdered the Jews, in order to make it up for them, they decided to, give Israel, give the Palestine to the Jews, and so now the Palestinians are paying the price, or the Arabs are paying the price for the sins of Europe. Right? That's all nonsense. Right? What we're talking about here predated the Holocaust by over 20 years. Right? Everything that these people were doing was not because of the Holocaust. They were doing it because of the international, 100% accepted recognition of the link between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Now, to be sure, these quotes that I'm writing were very quickly undercut for political reasons. All right. There were many in France and in Britain who were maneuvering in order to support the power of Faisal, and they were prepared to sacrifice the Zionist movement in order to do it. That should not surprise us. That's sort of typical realpolitik, right? What should surprise us is the degree to which everybody recognized the historical link between the people and the land. Right? So even within the British political circles, and remember, the Balfour Declaration is coming out of Britain, there was a tremendous back and forth on this issue. The phrase recognizing, quote, the historic title of the Jewish people to Palestine, unquote, had been discussed at San Remo, but it did not appear in the first British draft of the mandate. It was put back in at the urging of Chaim Weizmann. It was removed again in the second draft. All right. And Curzon, who was the foreign minister at the time, knew exactly what was going on. And I'm quoting what they, that is to say the Zionist movement, really want with this particular clause in the mandate. The reason they want it, well, 1 second, is that this sentence may be the foundation on which, at every stage, they may hold the claim for preferential treatment in Palestine and ultimately for the complete government of the country. I won't have it, unquote. But have it he did, because Lloyd George, the prime minister, had the clause reinserted with the variation that rather than viewing, quote, the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine as underpinning the claim to reconstitute Palestine as their national home, they changed this to the preamble to the mandate as the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. In other words, he left open the opening that besides the Jewish national home in the country, there might be something else in the country. And our own Evan Gottesman recently wrote an article about the San Remo Agreement. It's on the Israel Policy Forum, which I always recommend that people read because it's one of the best sources about what's going on in the Middle East. I think Evan overstates his case. We can argue about that some other time, but it's definitely an article worth reading. All right. But because of all of this maneuvering behind the scenes that we now know about, it makes the fact that Zionism succeeded at San Remo all the more remarkable and all the more significant. Simply put, support for Zionism was a matter of principle. Opposition was a matter of seeking political advantage, all right, or a lack of understanding. And I'll give you an example. Another aspect of what was going on was a real but tragic misreading of the reality of life for Jews. So, for example, Philippe Berthelot, who was at that point the Secretary General of the French Foreign Ministry, he dismissed the, quote, largely mystical, unquote, Zionist movement because it was based on the misconceived hope, quote, of rescuing large numbers of wretched Jews in Russia and Central Europe at a time when the great majority of these so-called Jews probably had very little real Jewish blood in their veins, unquote. I note in passing the great tragedy that there was enough Jewish blood in their veins to get 6 million of them murdered. And there's nothing at all mystical about that number. So Ephraim Karsh sums it up this way, quote, these difficulties notwithstanding, it was an extraordinary feat of diplomacy that within less than 5 years of the issuance of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, it had been endorsed by the official representative of the will of the international community, not in the technical sense of supporting the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, but in the deeper sense of recognizing the Jews as a nation deserving self-determination in its ancestral homeland. Now, one thing to think about is that the validity of the created Arab states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the borders of those states, all right, and their validity, that is all parallel to Israel's. It was the same process that created them. It was the same principles that were involved in creating them. If you deny Israel, you deny all of them as well. Now, there is one interesting difference. The Jewish people is one of the world's oldest peoples. At the time of their formation, there was no Syrian or Lebanese or Jordanian or Iraqi people or identity, which explains a great deal about the current chaos, what's going on right now in the Middle East. We are witnessing the tectonic shifts at the fault lines of these artificially constructed nations. And one could look at what's happening in the Middle East right now as a reversion to the pre-1920 reality, where what was dominant was not nation states, but rather tribes. And most certainly, there was no Palestinian identity. All right. It is no coincidence that one of the most cohesive forces in the Middle East are the Kurds, whose national strivings were ignored by the world powers, even though they were infinitely more cohesive than, quote, Lebanese. Arab beneficiaries of the mandatory system were Arabs currently residing in the places to be mandated. But Jews were scattered all over the world as a result of expulsion. The beneficiary of the decisions made in the Balfour Declaration, San Remo, and the League of Nations were not the Jews that were living in Palestine. The beneficiary, consciously, intentionally, was world Jewry. And the reason that that is significant is that people who don't entirely understand the situation point out that when Israel was formed, the Jews were still a minority in the land of Palestine. Right? That is significant for two reasons. Number one, everybody knew that the Jews were going to start out as a minority. They already were a minority. The whole point was to do something about them being a minority by allowing massive immigration, close settlement of the land, and a huge population increase of Jews in the land. That's what was supposed to happen. It was precisely that was betrayed by the British. It was precisely that the Arabs in Palestine worked so hard to prevent, that the British acceded to, allowing thereby the Nazis to murder 6 million Jews from precisely those areas that would have been most likely to make Aliyah to Israel. So to make the claim that, oh, when Israel was founded in 1948, Jews were in a minority, all right, that is the monumental example of the old joke about chutzpah, of killing your parents and then pleading for mercy because you're an orphan. All right. First, you block the Jews from coming, then you murder 6 million, and then you say, see, they're a minority. All right. For the Arabs, what was supposed to happen with the mandatory powers was a two-step process. Build up the institutions of governance, and then become independent states. For the Jews, consciously, intentionally, by the world powers, it was a three-stage process. Build up the population to the point of becoming a majority, build up the institutions, and then become independent. Right. And this was an attempt to avoid an anti-democratic situation, for example, the one that arose in Syria, where the Alawites, a minority, took over control of the country. That's the Alawites, by the way, is the Assad family, is an Alawite, a Muslim minority who persecute the other Muslims. All right? And we see how well all of that worked out. Right? There was no question that the desire here was to set up a Jewish majority. So you had an odd situation. There was a large Arab population with absolutely no defined sense of national identity. And you had a Jewish people with a highly developed sense of national identity, but extremely limited population. And the mandate system was an attempt to deal with both of those issues. All right. To award the Jewish people alone the equitable ownership of the political rights to Palestine, the right of self-determination, they would place these political rights in trust, not to vest until the Jews had both a population majority as well as the capacity of exercising sovereignty, and would require the trustee to facilitate Jewish immigration, but not Arab immigration, so as to obtain that majority more quickly. All right. I point out that the British did virtually nothing to block Arab immigration during the 1920s and 1930s. All right. And as a result of that, it became that much more difficult for Jews to establish a majority. The Peel Commission, a British commission looking at the situation in the 1930s, said, quote, Palestine was different from the other ex-Turkish provinces. It was indeed unique, both as the holy land of three world religions, that is to say, looking at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as religious groups, and as the old historic national home of the Jews, looking at the Jews as not as a religious group, but as a national group. The Arabs had lived in it for centuries, but they had long ceased to rule it. And in view of its peculiar character, they could not now claim to possess it in the same way as they could claim possession of Syria or Iraq. Now, the Arab population, and this is another important thing to underscore, because within the world of post-colonial, deconstructive, anti-Orientalism claptrap, this matters, all right? The Arab population was anything but invisible, all right? They knew, the world powers knew, the Zionists knew that there were Arabs in Palestine. This was not a surprise, all right? They were simply recognized as secondary, with a world of options before them. In the face of facilitated immigration and close settlement of Jews, the majority, Arabs, would quickly turn into a minority, which it did, even leaving aside the issue of a lack of national consciousness among the Arabs of Palestine. So just think about the fact that within 5 years of Israel's founding, even if there had been no exodus of Palestinians or no exodus of Arabs from Israel, right, within 5 years of Israel's founding, the Arabs would have been outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. That's how quickly a Jewish majority was able to be established when all of the roadblocks were taken away that prevented the Jewish immigration. All right. As far as Palestinians are concerned, all right, the Arabs in Israel were never mentioned as, quote, a people, unquote, much less a Palestinian people, unquote. The Arabs in Israel were simply a part of the tens of millions of Arabs who were going to exercise self-determination at the end of the Ottoman Empire. All right. They're simply part of all that huge Arab nation that was at the core of the founding of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. All right. You will not find the term Palestinian people in any dictionary before the mid-1970s. Any previous reference to Palestinians refers to Jews in Palestine, that is to say, Zionists. It appears to be the case that the very first time the word Palestinian was used outside of Palestinian circles was in a United Nations resolution in 1975. This is worth noting. The first drafts of the British Mandate were formulated by the World Zionist Organization. This confirmed the fact that the Jewish people were intended to be the exclusive beneficiary of the national rights that were enshrined in the mandate. There was no both sides-ism here. No Arab party was ever consulted regarding its views of the terms of the mandate prior to its submission for confirmation to the League Council in December of 1920. All right. Also, as confirmed by that Peel Commission report in 1937, the, quote, primary purpose of the mandate is to promote the establishment of the Jewish national home, unquote. The Jewish agency was recognized as the, agency that was supposed to get this all set up. There is no parallel Arab agency to set up an Arab or Palestinian state in Palestine. All right. And this goes back to what we said about the mandate, that Arab civil and legal rights are respected, but not political rights. The French tried to insert the phrase political rights of the non-Jewish population, and it was rejected. All right. There is a difference between talking about the national home of the Jewish people on the one hand and non-Jewish communities, where it's referring to the religious communities, not national communities. This was conscious and intentional national privileging. Lord Balfour, the guy who wrote the Balfour Declaration, stated explicitly to Curzon, the foreign secretary, the four great powers, that was Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, and in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In my opinion, that is right. So first of all, it's worth noting that we don't have to speculate about what Balfour meant. He's telling us what he meant. That's A. B, this idea of the 700,000 Arabs that are now inhabiting Palestine. Remember that of those 700,000 Arabs that are inhabiting Palestine, the British broke off 4/5 of Palestine to create the state of Jordan, previously called Transjordan. All right. So I'm not sure how many, but hundreds of thousands of those 700,000, all right, we're now going to be in the entirely Arab state of Jordan. All right. The remaining, say, 500,000, all right, they had the option. They could stay there and be a minority in a country where it was clear that there were going to be millions upon millions of Jews, and they could be a protected ethnic minority in that country. Or else they could go to any of the other 4 Arab countries that were being established. And remember, the vast majority of that 500,000, the vast majority were tenant farmers with no particular, land holdings. They hadn't been there from time immemorial. They were sort of migrant workers that could migrate anywhere they wanted to. All right. Balfour continued, I do not think that Zionism will hurt the Arabs, but they will never say they want it. Whatever be the future of Palestine, it is not now an independent nation, nor is it yet on the way to become one, referring to an Arab Palestine. Whatever deference should be paid to the views of those living there, the powers in their selection of a mandatory do not propose, as I understand the matter, to consult them. If Zionism is to influence the Jewish problem throughout the world, Palestine must be made available for the largest number of Jewish immigrants. Again, there were no illusions about what was supposed to be happening here. This was intentionally creating a Jewish ethno-state with protected minorities if they remained. Building up of national institutions happened very quickly. All right. They even said that by the mid-1920s, the Jews had already established what they needed in order to set up a government. But immigration was delayed with all of the tragic consequences. And it was not only the consequence that Jews were not a majority in 1948. All right. It was also the consequence that because Jews were not a majority earlier, we were not in a position to rescue the 6 million. All right, when the entire world was shutting their doors to Jews. All right, had Israel been established, had Jews been in control, had the gates to immigration been opened the way they were supposed to be, the Holocaust as it took place never could have taken place. That's truly the great tragedy of our time. Some additional considerations. First of all, the borders. All right, there's a lot of talk about, Israel doesn't have borders. All right, well, no, it doesn't have borders because it was attacked and there's no peace was made. It wasn't up to Israel to declare its borders. But when Palestine was first being discussed, all right, in the League of Nations document, there is a sort of a map of what they are talking about when they're talking about Palestine. It included all of what today is Jordan and 30 miles north of Israel's current border into Lebanon. All right, following the biblical definition. Intentionally, they mention this in the documents, the biblical definition of Israel stretching from Dan to Beersheba, which is a phrase repeated many times in the Bible, which again underscores the awareness that this is not just some colony that's being set up, this is a reconstitution of the Jewish nation. All right. Now, understand that Britain was the most powerful imperial nation on the planet in 1917. So when the Balfour Declaration came out in 1917, that was a big deal. But it was still merely the expression of sentiment by this imperial power over territory that they didn't really control. All right. The San Remo Conference took that declaration, that sentiment, and turned it into a universally recognized feature of international law. All right. And I say again that what's in there is not as important as what isn't in there. All right. There's nothing here about invisible natives, about Orientalism, about colonial blindness. All right. The people who put this together were perfectly capable of seeing Arabs, and they were able to see Arabs to the point that they gave Arabs 99% of the Ottoman Empire. All right. The debate, such as it was about the Palestine Mandate, was not about Palestinian Arabs and their national rights. The debate, such as it was the right of religious minorities, and in particular Catholics. All right. Not Muslims, not Palestinian Arabs, but Catholics. The French and the Italians were very concerned that the British, the classic Protestants, were going to be now in charge of the Catholic holy places in Palestine. All right. And even that debate has to be seen in the context of political machinations about the influence of the French or of the British on the Arabs coming out of Syria. All right. It's not about the Palestinian nation, because everybody knew there was no Palestinian nation. Now, to sum up, why is all of this relevant? Well, is there such a thing as the Jewish people? If you look at the PLO covenant, all right, it says no, that there is no such thing as the Jewish people. All right. San Remo says yes. Are Jews merely a religious community? The Palestinians say yes. San Remo says no. Is there a historic connection between Jews and the land of Israel? The Palestinians say no. San Remo says yes. Is Israel settler colonialism, or is it rather the reconstitution of our national home? All right. In the world, in the leftist blogosphere, they say that Israel is settler colonialism. San Remo says it's reconstitution. The mandate, quote, signified an unqualified recognition by the official representative of the will of the international community of the Jews as a national group. Now, there was an editorial, and again, this is not like I'm reading into the documents. This was what was publicly recognized at the time the San Remo Agreement was made. So there was an editorial in the London Times, April 27th, 1920, right at the conclusion of the San Remo Agreement. And I'm quoting, "We recently called attention to attempts that were being made to invalidate the declaration, which embodied wisely, albeit tardily, the only sound policy the Allies could adopt toward the Jewish people. But though this opposition was at length overcome and the promise given, the opponents of the promise have not wearied in their efforts to render it nugatory." I love that word. They dislike the idea that the Jews should have a national home of their own, and would fain persuade the non-Jewish world that the Jews are merely a religious denomination without special race character, otherwise known as nationalism. They knew back then that that's what was being talked about, and that was the position that was rejected by San Remo. Now, the thing that's sort of remarkable about this when you consider the importance of the document that I'm talking about is that if you were to ask 100 people who knew vaguely something about the Middle East and the founding of Israel, my guess is that 99 out of 100 would have talked about the United Nations partition plan of 1947. That was sort of like the birth certificate of Israel. And the San Remo agreement is, sort of has as much relevance as like the Magna Carta or something. But there's a real split between what San Remo means or how much it means and what the partition plan of 1947 means. San Remo was and is binding international law. It went into immediate effect. The partition plan was a non-binding resolution. All General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. It was a non-binding resolution. It was a suggested plan that was immediately rejected by the Arabs, and therefore, from a legal point of view, it's entirely null and void. Right? So why is there such an emphasis on the partition plan? Why does everybody look at that as if that's the big deal? Because it supports the myth that A, the United Nations created Israel, and B, that when the United Nations created Israel, the United Nations also created an Arab-Palestinian state that Israel prevented from coming into existence in an act of criminal imperialism, right? All of which is false. The United Nations did not create Israel. Okay, the United Nations does not have any stake in determining the future of the state of Israel any more than it has a stake in determining the future of Denmark or the United States. All right. The two-state solution that had been suggested, that Israel actually accepted, right, was rejected by the Arabs and thereby became null and void. All right. The wars that started afterwards were not wars started by Israel. They were wars that were started by Arabs. It is not Israel that bears responsibility for those wars. It's the Arabs that bear responsibility for those wars. So to say that we should now reward the Arabs for starting the wars that they started when they rejected the proposed peace plan, partition plan, that the Israelis accepted is an utterly bizarre statement of international law. San Remo has a different perspective. That Israel is based on the historic rights that preceded the UN, that preceded the League of Nations, that in fact preceded Islam and preceded Christianity. In fact, it preceded every other culture on the planet. All right. Number one. Number two, the Jewish state was intended to be Jewish by charter, not by demography. In other words, it doesn't get to be a Jewish state only when it reaches this magical number. It gets to be a Jewish state because it is a Jewish state. All right. And I would just point out that what Daniel Gordis taught an interesting lesson. I have mentioned this before, that when you look at the American Declaration and the American Constitution, when in the course of human events, and we talk about ourselves as human, right? The Israeli Declaration of Independence starts with the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. It's not talking about saving humanity. It's talking about the Jewish people. In the words of Berthelot, French foreign minister, the whole world was sympathetic to the aspiration of the Jews to establish a national home in Palestine. This is a legitimate desire. Giving away Palestine to Arabs was never discussed. It was never discussed because Arabs were getting everything else in the Middle East. Right? And this was compounded by the creation of Jordan, which was shut off from that broad Jewish immigration and close settlement. Right? which then made Jordan an Arab state in Palestine, as the way Palestine was defined by San Remo. So people today, when they are talking about a two-state solution, are in fact talking about another Arab state in Palestine, which may be wise or may be expedient. I'm not talking about that tonight. Again, Evan Gottesman wrote this incredible book for Israel Policy Forum, where he outlines, don't hold me to it, 10 different possible solutions. Two-state solution, confederation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this incredible chart of like 10 different factors. Will it be accepted by the Israelis? Will it be accepted by the Israeli government? Will it be accepted by the Arabs? Will it be accepted by the Palestinians themselves, the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He outlines a whole bunch of different options, none of them good, but he outlines a whole bunch of those options. And I'm not, I would love to have him, distribute that book to us and have everybody read it and have him come in and speak about it, because it's really, really good work. So it may be the case that setting up another Palestinian state in Palestine, that may be a really good idea, but it is anything but historically or morally or legally necessary. And that's what the San Remo conference was all about. So friends, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, a little bit over an hour. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to unmute everybody. Good, everybody's unmuted. So anybody have any comments, questions?
Rabbi?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, this is Dave Mason. I have a question. You had mentioned earlier on a couple of occasions that the Arabs in Palestine really did not have a national identity. And if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because the Arabs living there had a common culture, a common language, common traditions, and yet you're saying there's no national identity? I don't follow.
Right, okay. The Arabs living in Palestine were A, Arabs, and B, for the most part, Muslims, but also Christians, all right? And they did speak Arabic, and they were basically indistinguishable from Arabs in Damascus and Arabs in Beirut and Arabs in Baghdad or Arabs in Aleppo or anywhere else in the Turkish Empire.
I got it. Yeah, okay.
So, certainly they were distinctly Arabs, no question about it. And I don't, hopefully you did not get the impression I wasn't in any way trying to denigrate the Arabic language or culture or religion or anything like that. But they were not, in terms of nationalism, they were no different from the Arabs in Amman and the Arabs in Syria and the Arabs in Beirut and the Arabs in Iraq, all right? In fact, they repeatedly said so. When you had all of these commissions that were brought, the British commissions that were exploring this, you had Arabs after Arab after Arab, scholars, political leaders, religious leaders getting up and saying there has never been a separate Palestine. Palestine is simply southern Syria. There is no Palestinian nation. And what they were pushing for was Faisal's position of having Palestine remain southern Syria. All right. Nobody was pushing for an independent Palestinian state. All right. If you said the word Palestinian to an Arab in Jerusalem or Nablus in 1930, he would not know what you meant other than possibly referring to Zionists, referring to Jews. The word simply didn't exist. All right. And what you had instead were clans based to a great extent on where people came from. So for example, you had a large clan was the Al-Masri clan. Masri as in Mitzrayim. This is a clan that came from Egypt. Okay, so this was al-Baghdadi, people that came from Baghdad. You simply did not have what we today refer to as Palestinians with a Palestinian flag and a Palestinian national anthem and all of that is an outgrowth from an echo of Zionism. All right.
Okay.
We gave birth to the Palestinian national movement. All right. And again, I say, I'm not saying that their movement must simply be rejected. What I'm saying is that you can't retroactively go back to 1920 and say, oh, that was envisioned the whole time and Israel is in violation of that. To the contrary, it was not envisioned at all. That simply was not what anybody was planning. That was not what anybody was planning for. And if you didn't want Arabs in Palestine living under the Jews, all right, there was certainly no intention to have them have national independence. They would be living under the controlling power in Syria. Nobody ever talked about breaking off anything west of the Jordan River to create another Palestinian or to another Arab state. They had already done that with Jordan. They were done with that exercise.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Anybody else?
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
You talked about the fact that the British and the French and all the powers to be signed on to this agreement, and it was given the fact that Britain was going to control the area. Then why did Britain abrogate their responsibility and not do what they were supposed to have done within some
Question.
Okay, let me, did everybody hear that question? Because it was a little bit muffled.
No.
All right, if Britain had been in control of the area, why did they renege on their promise? All right, there is basically a 3-letter answer to that.
Oil.
Oil.
there you go.
Okay. So what happened was that it became clear during the 1920s and 1930s that the Arabs were viciously opposed to what had been literally mandated. All right, and the British recognized that appeasing them would put them in much better stead with the people, particularly in Iraq, that had the oil. It was a strategic resource. Britain, remember, had been the main imperial power. Britannia rules the waves, and they needed that oil. And so they were prepared to sacrifice the interests of the Zionist movement in order to secure their place with the Arabs. And you had a similar kind of dynamic going on when Truman was confronted with the issue of recognizing the state of Israel. And his Secretary of Defense and his Secretary of State were absolutely enraged at the idea that he would consider doing such a thing, and said right out, "You're going to tick off 150 million Arabs to support the Zionist movement? What's wrong with you?" And to the point where they said, "We will oppose you in the upcoming election if you choose to do this." It was a similar kind of realpolitisch, maneuvering. The parallel to that, though, understand, why was it that the Soviet Union was prepared to recognize the new state of Israel? All right, because they were vying for control. They thought that if they made nice with Israel, that would give them a strategic toehold in the region. So for these guys, it was all about geopolitics, and the British were prepared to write it off. There were politicians that referred to it as perfidy. They saw it as treason. But business was business, and that was really the dominating factor. It certainly was not out of any profound, newfound, oh wait, there were Arabs there, who knew? They all knew perfectly well. And just to give you an example, all right, it was the British, believe it or not, that appointed the Mufti as the titular head of the Palestinian Arab community. Now, this is the same Mufti that spent World War II doing propaganda broadcasts from Berlin. All right, the Mufti that was declared to be a war criminal. But they appointed him, again, as an attempt to, play politics among the locals. They actually overrode an election that the Mufti lost in order to put him in power, because they figured, pardon the expression, he may be a son of a bitch, but he'll be our son of a bitch. All right, that's not how it worked out. All right, Lou?
Well, two things, just in reference to what you just said.
Speak louder, please.
Just in reference to what you just said, I mean, we all did the same, we, Americans did the same thing by using Nazis to try to get information and so forth with regard to the Soviet Union at that time.
Sure.
And kind of pardon lots of people that obviously were involved directly in the Holocaust, which brings me to my second question wasn't the trigger for the UN, for the passage, or at least in my limited education in that regard, it was always thought, well, indeed, the Holocaust was the trigger for the UN supporting a partition and creating the state of Israel.
So was the Holocaust the trigger? I don't think it was the trigger, but it definitely did play a role in terms of the sort of the PR momentum.
Okay.
The trigger was the breakdown of the British Empire. Remember, after World War II, Britain was absolutely bankrupt. Right? They had gotten hammered, and I mean, to their honor and credit, they saved the world, right? But they had gotten hammered, and that's why you see the collapse of the British Empire everywhere after World War II. So they knew they had to get out of Palestine. They could not maintain their mandate. So that meant that all of a sudden, this area was going to be left without the mandatory power. Remember, the mandate ended on May 14th, 1948. Israel was declared on May 15th, 1948. So the British were getting out and basically looked at the UN and said, your problem, guys, figure it out. That's where the partition plan came from. And in the maneuvering for the partition plan, part of that, if you remember the movie Exodus, which I really think we ought to show again, just so that the kids haven't seen it, and I really think they need to see it. All right, as fanciful as it is in certain regards, but I think the kids really need to see it. They don't even know who Paul Newman was, for heaven's sake. The image of Holocaust survivors coming on rickety ships to come to Israel and then being turned away by the British soldiers. I mean, that was real drama, and it was real intentional drama. Abba Eban, the great Israeli diplomat, talks about how when there was this visiting delegation, the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, and Evan got the report that the ship was going to be coming into Haifa, he made sure that they went up there to see that. Okay, so it very definitely had a dramatic effect. But the question about what are we going to do about Palestine, all right, that was already on the table, not so much because of the Holocaust, but because of the breakdown of the British Empire. The mandatory power could no longer control its mandate.
Thank you.
Good question.
Rabbi?
Yes.
It's Ruth. The Balfour Declaration I certainly heard of very many times. But how about why the San Remo? Why hasn't it been said? I'm constantly hearing that Israel and Jews don't have good PR.
Yeah.
So what telling us and teaching us, why isn't it out there?
I'll tell you that I have a couple of different theories about why it's not out there. And let's just leave it at that it's a theory. one of the interesting things that has happened with the Netanyahu government, as the right in Israel has gotten stronger, is that, well, all right, let me back up. A couple of governments ago in Israel, when Ayelet Shaked came into the government and deputy foreign minister, all right, it was discovered that when diplomats would come to Israel, all right, they would be taken to Yad Vashem, and then from there to the president of Israel to present their credentials. And you can understand why they would do such a thing, right? But what she said was, why are we not taking them to the Kotel? And the short answer was because the Kotel was considered, quote unquote, occupied territory. And they didn't want to get into like a, any kind of argument about taking the diplomats into disputed or occupied territory. All right. And she said, wait a second, if we want to tell these visiting diplomats who we are, then we need to take them to the Kotel and then to Yad Vashem and then to the ambassador or to the president. Similarly, it was discovered that Israeli diplomats, when they get their training, had not been trained to defend the right of Jews to settle in Yehuda v'Shamron. Right? That, because remember, the foreign policy establishment in Israel was a leftist government up until 1977. They controlled the universities, they controlled the diplomacy and so forth. They were not crazy about the territories, and so they simply did not integrate that into the education of the Israeli diplomats. So the Israeli diplomats were not in a position to defend it anywhere. If you think about those two things, what that means is that the Israeli establishment was really looking at Israel and the potential for a Palestinian state as a reflection of the partition plan reality. In other words, the partition plan was basically the right idea. Didn't work out then, but that's what we can strive for now. Now that the two-state solution has become, although people talk about it all the time, oh, that's the one reasonable way, and blah, 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 it becomes increasingly unlikely. And it's recognized across the board by Palestinians, by Israelis, by Europeans, by everybody. It's increasingly unlikely. The left, the right, everybody agrees it's increasingly unlikely. Then people are going back to, well, wait a second, if we're not going to do that, what are we going to do? And that is why there is a reawakened interest in the principles that were described at San Remo. And when you finish with me here, Google San Remo conference, and you're going to see dozens and dozens of speeches and lectures. I didn't want to tell anybody about it because they're probably more informed about it than I am. But you're going to see this is all over the place now, because it's the partition plan and the approach of the partition plan is that much less realistic now than it was before. So that's why there's been infinitely more information about the San Remo agreement over the past 10 years than there has been over the previous 40. Arthur, were you going to ask something?
I think you used the term United States once during your lecture. So where was the United States in all this? I understand they were not members of the League of Nations and so on, but they had nothing to do with implementing San Remo and
they very much did. No, they very much did. They were not in the League of Nations, but there was a vote of Congress to support the League of Nations resolution. So that is, in other words, the League of Nations resolution was the official policy of the United States. That's A. B, the Americans were very opposed to the British betrayal of the mandate. There were all kinds of public statements about how it was disgraceful for the British to break their promise. That's basically what they were being told. Of course, the Brits' response to that was, okay, you come over here and put your troops on the line to try and keep these Jews and Arabs apart. All right. So that was, the back and forth that was going on during the 1940s. But it's, and I would also mention that when you were having the conferences, the Bermuda Conference and the, oh my goodness, I wrote a paper about it and I'm trying to remember. There were two conferences about refugees. The Bermuda Conference about Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. It's escaping me, right? It'll come back to me. In which America participated, and they did not push the British and say, you were the guys that are responsible for this, you need to open up. And so in that sense, the United States really sort of failed the Jewish community before the war. After the war, they were pushing that much harder for the British to open up. And that's one of the reasons the British said, we're out of here. We can't handle this.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Going once. Going twice. Okay, guys, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next
Thank
week,
you.
remember we
Thank
we
you.
do a question and answer on Tuesday night. I have my lunch class at 12:30 on Wednesday, and there'll be another lecture I got to figure out about what on next Thursday night.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Be safe.
Good Shabbos.
Good night, all.
Good night.